Well, welcome to another episode of the IT Woodworker. This is Chris.kousoulas, your host, and I'm joined back by returning guest Nick.santilli, who is sitting in a very beautiful location. Nick, what exotic realm are you in? This is crazy.
Gulf Coast of Florida, and it's going to be warm today, so I'm sweating a little bit, but couldn't take my office anymore this week, so
Well,
here
that's it.
we
Well,
are.
you can jump in the pool as soon as we're done. So
Thank you, I appreciate it. I have to wait till after we have to be done.
please, or we're just going to be on voice, so there will be no video. So that's
Okay,
your
fair.
call. We'll just kind of play it by ear. All right. So Nick, hey, thanks for joining us today. Well, we're going to dive into some security topics here, and we wanted to focus on data classification. Now, I have a very small understanding of data classification, and I tried to, look into it a little bit more, but I can't do it justice with an explanation. So Nick, if you would just kind of, talk a little bit about data classification and why it's important to get us rolling here.
Sure. I think we can maybe talk about things that we know and understand a little bit better to maybe help with this. And in everything in life, we kind of categorize things, right? You're a woodworker, right? You've got a bunch of tools and parts for that tools, maybe jigs and different blades for your routers and things like that. And so you classify these into different groups to organize them, right? Keep track of them. It's the same thing with our data. What do we want to do with this data? And does this data, what are the levels? Is this data that we have that should be public? It's public domain. Everybody has access to it. You can Google it. Your kid can, learn about it, whatever. Is it internal? Is it more kind of, IP maybe for your business? And so maybe you need to classify that a little bit different. This isn't just for public knowledge. Then you can get into fully confidential. These are things that only a subset of leaders or senior folks in the organization should have access to. And then restricted, right? Restricted is probably on a need to know basis. This is stuff that probably legal's involved with. Really need to be careful. This should not be shared. This should not be, put in print until everything's been defined and we're comfortable with it. So, as we classify these things, we put them into categories based on, how sensitive and important they are and what their impact is going to be if they're shared in the wrong places. If you take something that's confidential, say it's, executive leadership is talking about, cutbacks or something like that, and it's like, hey, we need to keep it amongst the C-suite, and then that information leaks beyond that. What's that impact? Well, that could be moderate to high depending on what the outcomes of those cutbacks might be. So anyway, I'll pause, but does that kind of help with what your understanding is?
It does make sense. And then as I'm thinking this through here, that sounds great on a day forward kind of scenario where you're saying, hey, this is everything that's confidential, this is everything that's restricted, this is everything that's IP. So this is how we're going to designate it moving forward. But what do you do with all that stuff that's legacy? Because in the system, I mean, how do you even go? Because it's going to be block, object, file, it's going to be stored in different places. How do you even figure that out?
That's been one of the bigger challenges in tackling this. I've been talking off and on about data classification with some of my peers and folks in the security industry for a while, and that's the challenge, right? Everybody wants to do it, everybody sees the point in it, but getting to that legacy data, getting to the stuff that's sitting on that user's laptop for the last 8 years that is nowhere else, it's a real challenge. It's combination of policy, combination of just starting where you're at and going from here forth. We're going to apply these principles and these controls. There's tools out there, obviously, that can help with that. We've got AI. You and I have talked about AI and on this podcast previously, and there are tools that can be used to help with that. But at the end of the day, it's got to be a very deliberate here's where we're going to draw the line, and from here forward we're going to do it.
Mhm.
I think it's a pipe dream to say, okay, we're going to get everything legacy. I mean, at One Neck, I've been with the company for 18 years. I've got files and folders from when I was an engineer, 18 years ago that aren't going to fit into that classification because I probably won't even look at them again, but they're there.
So the classification, and you're talking about, hey, there's files that have been here for this long. It needs to be tightly wrapped with your policy then as well, or is it one and the same? Because I would assume if the data classification is set up correctly with policy, then if you have, stringent rules that say this can be destroyed after 7 years, you don't have 8 years, you don't have 18 years of data. And it saves you money when you start looking at the cost of, storage.
Yeah. I mean, storage is a huge part of it. How much are we retaining for how long? What are the conditions around it? Is it classified as something that should be stored for longer or shorter? There are so many ways to approach this, and so I don't want to just jump into a specific tool set or
Sure.
a manufacturer, but the 5,000-pound gorilla is Microsoft, just because they're the ones who run the applications that develop, a lion's share. I won't make up a statistic off the top of my head, but a lion's share of our documents are .doc, .ppt, .xlsx.
Sure.
And so Microsoft has kind of a major leg up in the tool sets that can be used to say, hey, if you're opening it in our app and you want to enforce data classification, we can help with that. So yeah, there's some ways to do it that will force you, hey, if you open it up and you've enacted data classification rules, Microsoft apps will help to enforce that even on older documents.
So you said enforce. How do you enforce, and how granular can that be to enforce a policy? Because I mean, I print it out and I give it to somebody. Wasn't supposed to.
Right. So there are. I may meander a little bit on this on this one, but in terms of Microsoft applications, you can set it up so that only people, we all have like, if you're using Microsoft apps, chances are these days you've got like an O365 login. My login is tied to my single sign-on. It's just tied to everything else in my company. So if somebody in my organization creates a document and they determine that this fits the criteria to classify it as, confidential, let's just stick with confidential for now. They can say only these specific people have access to this. So they could say individual people, they could say people with certain AD credentials or permissions. So recently I received a document that I had access to view. And it was actually something that I was working with a third party, to finalize a contract. And it didn't have permissions for that third party, even though in part of the process that was fully acceptable and expected that they would have it. There were some, tuning things that needed to change. Well, I kind of went through this, okay, well, I'm an engineer at heart. Let me troubleshoot the problem and just try to get this done. And so my first thought was, I'll just jump on a Teams call or WebEx or Zoom and share my screen and walk through it with the person, make sure they were good. Well, I went to share, and Microsoft, because
they didn't have the right
classification was set, it literally would not let me share Microsoft Word. Okay, well that's cool, from a technical standpoint, that's cool. All right. So I thought, okay, I'll just screenshot, and see if I can, get it done that way, because I was curious at this point. Wouldn't let me screenshot. I did a screenshot of Word. All I got was the desktop behind Word. Wow. So Microsoft Word went totally transparent. So okay, I couldn't. You talked about printing it. Guess what? There were print restrictions. I couldn't
Yeah.
print that and then take a photo or something like that. So,
Mhm.
at the end of the day, I could have probably done this and, taken a picture
Sure.
of my screen, but I was like, hey, let's get this, tuned to work the way we need it and then move forward. But, those are the types of things that applications can do to help enforce that. You can't
Mhm.
just print it out.
Yeah.
You can't just screenshot it. Another thing, and this can happen via myriad different tool sets. You can restrict different pieces of data, based on different criteria, from even being able to be pushed to a USB port, offloaded to a drive,
Mhm.
put into an attachment, or if it's put into an attachment, suddenly it's encrypted and it can't be read because that's against policy. So
That
there are a lot of
USB piece is kind of old school, but before it was either yes
yeah,
or no. You can either use your USB or you can't. So you're saying that the tools will actually
right,
say, based on the classification of this data, you could use your USB, or it's restricted, you can't.
yeah, yeah. And there's sorry, that jogged a thought, and I'm trying to remember. Oh, from a the other side of that. So there's the restriction that prevents you from doing that. Obviously, that's ideal, right? We want to try
Yeah.
to stop the leak and the insider threat before it happens, whether it's intentional or not. But what if it does? What if that gets out? What if, and now the organization is trying to track it down? Well, there's forensic tools that can track the hash of that file to determine, oh, it was moved on this date at this time to a USB port on this machine. So if you
Sure.
haven't locked down USB ports, if you haven't put those types of restrictions in to prevent that, you can actually go back and forensically, in some cases, determine, yep, that file was moved by this person on this machine to this USB port at this date and time.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So you can kind of catch the bad guys out there then that are doing it. So what does an
Yeah.
engagement look like then if you're gonna help somebody? And I mean, I know it's all based on the size of the organization and the amount of data, but there's got to be a process you go through.
Yeah, so much of this is sitting down and just having conversations with the organization that wants to, take this approach. What data do you have? Where do you want to start? Right. Let's start with your crown jewels, the most highly protected, the restricted or confidential pieces, because that's probably your smallest
Yeah.
quantity of things, right? Let's start simple and then work out from there. Let's start simple. Let's start with the things that are most critical to protect.
Mhm.
Maybe it's not the fewest number of things are the most critical, but if you're trying to protect them, let's start with the things that you're most concerned with. So it's a lot of conversation and helping to identify, what falls into these different levels of classification. How do you think about those things? Is it really confidential or is it just internal? Is it really internal or is this something that's public knowledge? So, helping organizations really get their mind around what the definitions of these are and then applying that to their own data. Because at the end of the day, even though the security practitioners at OneNeck, for instance, have been doing this their entire careers, talking to people, classifying data, protecting data, um, they don't know your data or
Yeah.
Acme Corp's data. So it's a lot about helping to define and understand that stuff and letting the entity then say, okay, we're going to take a pass at this and try to drop it into the top two buckets for now. So it's not a quick process. It takes time and it's very I always get these two terms mixed up: subjective. They use it right, subjective or objective. It's really up to the person doing it to determine,
That's what I would say.
right. So,
So
yeah,
it
so
kind of
that's
reminds me, because I'm sure as soon as you come in, it reminds me of when we talked to customers in the past about, DR, what's important. And it's like with data classification, it's like, what's confidential? Everything's confidential. Well, if you make this confidential, then you can't do this. Or, well, then it's not all confidential. It's like DR. It's like, so what's the most important? We got to have everything up and running. Okay, here's the cost. Oh, well,
Right.
I guess we don't need to have everything up and running. So
Yeah.
it's probably the biggest portion. And like with anything, it's education.
So yeah, it's very much about education, until everybody understands what the impacts are and how to think about classifying that data. It's really hard to proceed. And like you said, everybody wants to do everything until they get the dollar sign, and then they go, oh, okay, let's dial this in a little bit and figure out how to start, and maybe be a little phased in our approach. So
you had a real world scenario there when you were looking at a contract and you're trying to share it with a contractor who actually had the permissions, but there were some challenges. Do you have any other maybe real world kind of scenarios, things that you've discussed, or things you could talk about, things maybe that are on this is the big one, AI related or anything crazy like that?
so yeah, I mean, this is not my scenario, but just as I've been thinking about, all that's happening in the very speedy evolution of AI and its implications and in all of our lives, that should be considered when you're classifying. Is it something? I mean, take a step back. Our CISO sent out a message saying, if you're going to use these tools, you need to be thoughtful about what kind of information you're dropping into, say, Chat GPT, because once you do, the end user license agreement basically says this is public domain. This is owned by Chat GPT and Microsoft and everybody else. Once you put it in there, so be careful. So. Is that a classification, or is that just kind of a policy on, hey, if it's this type of information, you need to refrain from sharing it?
And that's a reflection of how fast IT is moving, because 6 months ago, you never would have a policy about Chat GPT, right? Because be like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, for sure. Maybe a conversation for our next AI Chat GPT podcast, but it is becoming interesting how there are entire roles starting to be formed to determine how businesses should interact with Chat GPT and set their data classification and rules of engagement. So I think at the end of the day, when we talk about what can happen with critical data is, and maybe this is me being a glasses half full kind of guy, which maybe doesn't align well with also being a cybersecurity person.
Yeah.
But I feel like most of the time insider threat is accidental or not on purpose,
not
right?
malicious. Yeah.
It's not malicious in nature. It's people trying to get things done. People just maybe even just being careless. That malicious behavior, it certainly happens. There are bad actors out there. There are people who are disgruntled, who just do what they're going to do. But whether it's AI, whether it's accidentally sharing the wrong document, hitting forward on a thread that they didn't look to the bottom and realize, oh, there was something, sensitive in there I shouldn't have done. I mean, most of the time it's just people, and people are always going to be the weakest link, which is why we look for tools, software, AI, things like this to help us enforce them, because more often than not, we're protecting against carelessness, not maliciousness.
And on that note, that's the reason why I had to take 2 security tests yesterday, because I'm the weakest link.
I'm sure you're not alone, Chris. No, I know you're not alone.
well, thanks. You made me feel better about that then. So, well, excellent. Is there anything in wrap up there on data classification we didn't touch on there? Anything you think's important we should tell the viewers about?
No, I think, to me, it's looking at the ways that the stuff, that data most traditionally is leaked or shared. Email, it's probably the A number one. Recently we had a 0 day with Move It. So, a lot of data transfer protocols were kind of up in the air, and those can be concerning, but I think email is probably number one. Chat, any more people are using things like Slack or Teams or, you name it, to share their information or docs. Hey, take a look at this and give me some feedback. Maybe they're Googling it. Maybe they're, dropping into AI and saying, hey, how can I better organize these concepts? So,
Yeah.
Just be thoughtful about what you're putting where. The big challenge, I think, for users is distraction. Just trying to get 10 things done all at the same time, having a video call like this, chatting on the side, having a text come in, checking your calendar for what's the next meeting and do I have my notes ready for that. It's juggling too many balls and not paying attention to, hey, this is something I probably shouldn't just forward off or put into Chat GPT or whatever it may be. So at the end of the day, it's people. I think education is always, awareness is a big thing. There's lots of training libraries and content out there to help with that. But people are the weakest link. So educating them first, organizations taking the time to start understanding what those classifications are and how to start dropping, going through the time consuming effort to drop it into those buckets and just start, right? You mentioned at the beginning, and I'll take this full circle. How do you get to that legacy document that's a decade old?
Mm-hmm.
If you worry about those things, you'll never get started. So, yeah.
Delete it and start today. So,
there you go.
Well, excellent. Hey, Nick, as always, this was a pleasure. I'm looking forward to our next conversation, which I think will be Chat GPT, our third go round with all the excitement that's going on. But until then, sir, and go jump in the pool, enjoy the beautiful day, and we'll talk soon.
I got to see when my next meeting is, but I might have to.
Hey, thanks, Nick. Have a good day.
Take care, Chris.